Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Steer.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Tim O'Keefe about Epicurean and Stoic views of freedom and determinism.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Tim O'Keefe, professor of philosophy at Georgia State University. Tim specializes in ancient philosophy, especially in Hellenistic philosophy and Epicurus, and he's written extensively about the topic of free will as it and related issues come up in the ancient period. Three of his publications, I think, will be of special interest to our listeners. First, he's the author of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry called Ancient Theories of Freedom and Determinism, which covers figures from Aristotle to Plotinus. He also has a book called Epicurus on Freedom, published by Cambridge University Press in 2005. And finally, he wrote the chapter in the Routledge Companion to Free Will on the Stoics. And we'll link to all these publications in the show notes. Tim has generously agreed to talk about both Epicureanism and Stoicism on the podcast today, and we're excited to have him. Welcome to the show, Tim. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on free will in ancient philosophy?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of
I, like you said, I work in ancient philosophy. I do a lot of work in ancient ethics and also in ancient theories of freedom and determinism, mainly on Epicurus, but I've written on a bunch of other people too, like Aristotle and Plato's eschatology and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I originally became interested in this topic a long time ago, very early in graduate school, when we were doing a class on Hellenistic philosophy, and we read about the Epicurean doctrine of the swerve, this random atomic motion that somehow is supposed to preserve our freedom. And it just seemed really bizarre and very wrong to me. And I read some things where other scholars tried to talk about that the role was supposed to have in preserving our freedom, because our texts on this topic are very scattered and very unclear. And I thought those didn't seem quite right to me. So I just started my dissertation eventually on the topic of figuring out what is the Epicurean theory of human freedom, how does it relate to this indeterministic motion, the swerve. Mm-hmm. But then in order to understand Epicurus, it kind of brought in a bunch of other figures, because I argue that Epicurus is appropriating a lot of what Aristotle has to say, especially his discussion of tomorrow's sea battle in Day Int 9. And then Epicurus is in a conversation with the Stoics, and they in turn are both in conversation with the later academic skeptics. So, a whole bunch of people's notions of freedom and determinism in the ancient world kind of got drawn in trying to figure out what Epicurus had to say.
Oh, yeah. Cool.
That's interesting.
Well, could you start by giving a bit of historical context for our discussion? Who were the Epicureans and Stoics, and when did some key figures in the movement live? What are their key ideas, or any other background that you think might be helpful?
Sure. So Epicureanism and Stoicism were two of the predominant philosophies in the so-called Hellenistic period. And that's the centuries following the death of Alexander the Great, which is in 323 BCE. And then Aristotle died the year afterwards in 322 BCE. So Epicurus founded the Garden, which was his philosophical community in Athens, in 306. And then the Stoa was founded a couple of years later. So that's sort of the chronology of how they're a little bit after Aristotle. But then they kind of were a going concern for centuries later with lots of different Stoics. And because we've lost so many of the writings of the old Stoics and of Epicurus himself, we have to rely on a lot of later Roman figures to get information on what's going on, like Lucretius, who was a Roman poet and adherent to Epicureanism. And then the Roman statesman and academic skeptic Cicero is another important source for these schools.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful. Well, let's talk about Epicureanism first. And like the pre-Socratic philosopher Democritus, Epicurus was a thoroughgoing materialist. He thought that all that exists are bodies made up of atoms and empty space, the void. And your entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on ancient theories of freedom and determinism You say that the Epicureans believe that Democritus's position would imply that the future is predetermined in a way that would make choice and deliberation futile. What exactly is the worry here?
Yeah. So I think in order to understand Epicurus's worry, I want to first talk about what Aristotle has to say
Mhm.
in De Interpretatione 9, chapter 9. And the De Ent is his treatise on semantics, basically.
Mhm.
And in that chapter, he's talking about the principle of bivalence, which is the doctrine that for every statement, it has one of two truth values, either as true or false. And Aristotle, at least on most interpretations of the De Ent, uh, denies that this doctrine is true when it comes to statements about the future, about contingent matters. And he's worried that if we believed in bivalence, it would make the future kind of fixed and predetermined.
Mhm.
So the example he gives is tomorrow's sea battle. You make a statement like, tomorrow there will be a sea battle. And his worry is that if that statement is either true or false, it's fixed what's going to happen. But deliberation and action both presuppose that the future is open, right? That there's some sort of openness in the future. And therefore, you can think about which of these do I want to make true as opposed to one of them already being true. So
Mhm.
that's what Aristotle says in De Ent 9. And there's a similar ancient argument that kind of proceeds from truth values called the lazy argument, where let's imagine that you have a statement like Tim will die of cancer. I don't know, and that statement is either true or false already. But if it's
Mhm.
already either true or false, then why should I bother deliberating, taking care, for instance, like stopping smoking or whatever, in order
Mhm.
to change what's going to happen if it's already true or false?
Right.
So that's sort of the background. But those arguments have to do with truth values, right? It doesn't talk
Mhm.
about causation at all. But Epicurus, Cicero reports at least, also denied the principle of bivalence when it comes to statements about the future. And so he thinks that causal determinism and determinism about what some authors call logical determinism are linked to one another.
Mhm.
Because if there's going to be a determinate truth value about the future, that's going at some time. Like let's say now it is true that there will be a sea battle tomorrow. That has to be true in virtue of presently existing circumstances. Like something is the case now that either will bring it about that the sea
Mhm.
battle will happen, or it precludes it from happening, causally speaking.
Right.
So there's this linkage between causal determinism and truth value determinism, if you want to call
Mhm.
it that, PB.
Yeah.
And so his worry is that Democritus thinks that atoms all move just in accordance with these laws of nature that have no exceptions. And if that's the case, then what will happen in the future is already settled, right? It's already
Right.
set what will happen, and therefore it's inevitable. And
Hmm.
that's going to make action and deliberation futile.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Well, like Aristotle, Epicurus was interested in how agents like us shape our characters over time, and he took this to be relevant to our moral responsibility for our actions. Can you say a little bit about how this works in the Epicurean view?
Sure, I'm happy to. So Epicurus' discussion of this is in his kind of largest treatise, one of his most important ones, on nature, which is a discussion of the nature of the world. But unfortunately, it's almost entirely lost to us. Like little bits and pieces of it have been recovered from Herculaneum, which was buried in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius.
Mhm.
Hmm.
I'm saying all this just to underline that when you have papyrus scrolls that are like kind of buried in volcanic eruption stuff, it
Right.
damages them a lot. So it preserves them, but it also damages them a lot. So what I'm about to say is super controversial because people argue about like from these bits and pieces that have lots of gaps in them, what does it mean? How does it work? Okay,
Right.
so that's our source for this.
Yeah.
But anyway, in that treatise, or the section of the treatise that we have, the bits and pieces we have, Epicurus says that we have seeds. And these seeds are sort of psychological propensities to either develop this way or develop that way. But the way we develop is not preset, it's up to us the way we develop. So part of what gives us moral responsibility is our ability to decide which way we develop, he says. Okay. And the way I interpret this is in light of something that Lucretius says, the later Epicurean poet, where he says non-human animals like lion or stags or whatever have temperaments that are given just by the atoms that make up their psyche. So so stags are naturally timid, and lions are naturally bold and irascible because they have more fire atoms, they say. So their psychology their understanding of the mind is a little off.
Sure.
We'll excuse them. But he says humans aren't like that because we can use our reason to decide which way we should develop. So it's our reason that gives us control over our psychological development. So I kind of read the On Nature passage about our control over our own psychological development in light of what Lucretius says about humans' ability, unlike other animals, to shape their character through their use of reason and to do things like think of the consequences of their actions and what's really good and bad and what would a good life be like.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. Well, you mentioned the swerve earlier, and even in contemporary work on free will, one often finds references to this Epicurean idea that in nature, some atoms swerve in a way that's not causally determined. And it's usually suggested that this is relevant to our freedom somehow. Could you explain the idea of the swerve and talk about the different interpretations of it that have been given?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Epicurus is an atomist. So he thinks that there are two fundamental things in the world. There are atoms, which are unsplittable bits of matter. And then there's the void, which is the empty space that the atoms move through. The atoms have various causes of their motion. One of them is their weight. There is a single motion downward. There's no bottom to the universe, but it goes kind of eternally. And all the atoms move straight down through the void. But they also sometimes they run into one another, and then there are collisions, and they get entangled with one another. And when they get entangled, this makes macroscopic bodies come into existence. And so what the swerve is, it's an additional cause of atomic motion, besides things like weight, and the swerve and entanglements and reboundings and that kind of stuff. And it's not mentioned in any of the texts that we have by Epicurus himself, but Lucretius says that what it is, it's a random sideways movement at uncertain times and places. But I think the uncertainty here is just a way, it's not really epistemic, that we don't know when they're going to swerve. It's supposed to be genuinely undetermined, the particular times in which they swerve. And he says, you need to have the swerve for two reasons. One is for their cosmology, because if the only natural motion of atoms were straight down and they all move at equal speed, which the Epicureans also think, they would never have collided with one another. It would be like cars going down the highway, all at the same speed in their lanes. But if you have one car moving off to the side, it smashes into another car, and then you have like a 30-car pileup on the downtown connector in Atlanta. So, so it has that cosmological role. But the one that people have paid more attention to is he also says that this random sideways swerve somehow saves us from fate, right? From things being necessitated, and allows us to act in the way that we wish and to pursue pleasure as we will. Because the Epicureans in their ethics are hedonists. They think that ultimately what's good for us is pleasure. So that's what Lucretius says. But this is one of those topics where there's no settled view. There's not anything like a consensus or even a mainstream on how the swerve is supposed to help secure our freedom.
Interesting.
So I'll quickly go through a couple of them.
Sure.
So one of them, and it was really the more traditional view for quite a while, was to make Epicurus into something like an act libertarian in the current debate in free will and determinism, right? So the idea here is that he embraced something like the principle of alternate possibilities. In order for us to be genuinely responsible for our actions, we have to have this ability to do otherwise. But if determinism is true, we don't have this ability. And therefore, the swerve saves us from that because our souls, our minds, really, our psyches, are made up of atoms. And so if you have occasional atomic swerves, occurring, or that it's possible for them to occur in the chain that leads to the production of human action, then we do have this ability to do otherwise. So that's one very common and fairly popular interpretation. I mean, I think it's wrong, but it's one interpretation.
Right.
Another is David Sedley, based on those On Nature 25 passages that I said were so obscure, thinks that our ability to kind of control these seeds and develop the way that we do, he thinks that it actually amounts to Epicurus being some sort of non-reductive physicalist, where we have psychological characteristics, including our ability to make decisions, that aren't reducible to atomic motions. And it ends up really, in my view, becoming something like an interactive causal dualism, where you have emergent psychological properties reaching down and being able to make changes at the atomic level when we freely make decisions that aren't determined by the atoms in our psyche. But then, says Sedley on this interpretation, if atomic motion were entirely determined by these laws of physics, and there were no kind of wiggle room or looseness in the laws of physics, we wouldn't be able to exercise this sort of independent psychological power. Mm-hmm. So this swerve is supposed to give some sort of wiggle room or looseness at the atomic level for the emergent self to freely act. So that's the second one. The third one, finally, I mean, there's another one, but I don't want to go into every one. The third one, what I advocate is that, at least when it comes to the swerve, Epicurus is not concerned with the problem of free will and determinism at all, really, right? What he's concerned with is this problem of fatalism that I talked about before, the sort of thing that Aristotle talks about in De Int 9, okay? Mm-hmm. Because in that passage where Lucretius is introducing the swerve, he doesn't talk about moral responsibility. What he talks about is our ability to move ourselves as we want to in order to get pleasure, and that this is the same ability that all other animals have, even though these animals are not, according to the Epicureans, rightly subject to praise or blame. So I think he's really worried about this other problem of our ability to move ourselves around as we wish to. Mm-hmm. And then the only thing the swerve does is to kind of guarantee the openness of the future in the way I described before when talking about like the lazy argument and the sea battle.
Right.
That what the swerve does, it helps us act effectively because what will happen in the future is not yet predetermined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool.
In the epilogue of your book, Epicurus on Freedom, you said that Epicurus inadvertently contributed to the birth of the free will problem, even if he wasn't concerned with it, as you said. Before we turn to Stoicism, could you say a bit about what role you think Epicurus played in the development of the free will debate?
Yeah. So if I'm right, Epicurus himself, at least when he introduced the swerve, wasn't really concerned with, the problem of like alternate possibility, principal ultimate possibilities or anything like that. But what happened, this is based on what Cicero says. So Cicero in the 1st century BCE wrote a number of treatises kind of laying out the Epicurean and Stoic and other views, and one of them is on fate. And in that, he talks about what the academic skeptic Carneades puts forward. So Carneades, as a skeptic, doesn't put forward any positive positions of his own, but instead he still makes up positions just for the sake of argument to contribute to the debate. And so what Carneades said, according to Cicero, is he tries to improve the Epicurean position as a counterweight to the Stoic position. And he said, look, Epicurus, you don't need a random swerve. The random swerve is a mistake. You're also wrong to think that the principle of bivalence is threatening, because the mere fact that it's true that something will happen in the future doesn't make it inevitable or beyond our power to affect, right? Mm-hmm. What will happen, he thinks, is a matter of what Carneades calls a free motion of the mind. So he thinks that causal determinism is incompatible with us having control over our actions, but that's different from bivalence. Mm-hmm. And he says, if you think that there's a free motion of the mind, which is voluntary and under our control, and that is something that would give us sort of this two-way power, either to perform an action or not to. Once you have that, that's enough to secure our freedom. And positing some kind of indeterministic atomic motion in addition to that is beside the point. So that's what Carneades says. And on my view, although it's somewhat controversial, like people, put different stories forward. On my view, Carneades' view is something like an agent causal view. It's a libertarian agent causal view. And it's the first clearly libertarian view. Later on, the Aristotelian Alexander Aphrodisius put forward another libertarian view in response to the Stoics. And St. Augustine was heavily influenced by Cicero, because St. Augustine himself was an academic skeptic for a while before he returned to Christianity. And although he doesn't talk about De Fato, I think it's perfectly reasonable to think that he probably read De Fato. And I think that the position that Augustine puts forward in his very early treatise on the free choice of the will is similar to the one that Carneades put forward.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let's turn now to the Stoics. And unlike the Epicureans, the Stoics think of the happenings in the world, including our actions, as fated in some sense. Could you describe the Stoic picture and say whether there's room for freedom in it?
Sure. So the Stoics, like the Epicureans, are materialists. They think that all beings that have causal power are, matter. They do differ from the Epicureans because they don't believe in the void. They have what's called a plenum theory. So it's all full, not discrete matter moving in the void. But they also believe in God, and God himself is a material being who's identical with the cosmos as a whole. So they're pantheists. And God is wise and powerful and benevolent. And God fates everything. The way that God fates everything, though, is not by having some, like some prophecy, you will kill your father and sleep with your mother. And then God has set it up so that no matter what you do or no matter what choices you make, this inevitable, event will happen.
Right.
That's the fate of superstition, right? The fate of the physicists is where God fates things by setting up the relationships of cause and effect in the universe to kind of ensure that as the universe unfolds, things will occur in accordance with this divine plan. So the Stoics are the first ones to be very clear and obvious causal determinists. And that's linked to fate because the way that things are fated is through God setting up these relationships of cause and effect to ensure that what he plans will come to pass. So that's the Stoic picture of the world.
Right.
And the way that we can be free, but let me talk first about the lazy argument very briefly, and then talk about moral responsibility on the Stoic picture.
Yeah.
So about the lazy argument, like let's say that I'm walking along a path and I'm bitten by a venomous snake. And I'm trying to decide, should I go to the hospital or not in order to recover from the snake bite? Right. And someone might come forward and say, but it's either fated and inevitable that you will recover from the snake bite or fated and inevitable that you will not. And so either way, right, what's the point in doing anything? Right.
Right.
And Chrysippus, who is the third head of the Stoa, has, I think, a very convincing reply to this, which is that our own actions are part of the causal chain that bring about the fated outcomes. So our actions, which themselves are fated, actually are what make the outcomes happen, right? So if I get bitten by a snake and I'm trying to wonder what should I do, I should go to the hospital. I should get the antivenin, right? Because if I don't, I'll die, right? So a counterfactual if Tim doesn't go to the hospital, he will die, can still be true, even if it's fated and causally determined that I will, as a matter of fact, decide to go to the hospital and get the injection, right? Because it's through my action of going to the hospital that the fated outcome comes to be. Right. So the way Chrysippus puts it, look, even if it's fated that there will be a boxing match, it's not fated that there will be a boxing match whether or not the people get in the ring.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's an utterly convincing reply to the lazy argument. argument.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That causal determinism doesn't imply inevitability in some sort of way that makes action and deliberation futile.
Right.
Yeah.
As far as moral responsibility goes, really what they have, if I'm going to put it in somewhat anachronistic terms, is they think of moral responsibility as being tied up with kind of moral attributability. If the explanation for an action refers back to your own beliefs and desire and character, then we can say you're the one who's causally responsible for it. We can attribute the action to you, and therefore you are the one who can also be rightly held accountable for it.
Mm-hmm.
So, but to say a little bit more about that, the Stoics have, I think, a very interesting action theory. So, inanimate objects like logs or stones are kind of pushed around by external forces, according to the Stoics. But when it comes to animals, animals move themselves around in response to impressions. Okay, so like Fido, for instance, Fido is hungry. Fido sees a bowl of chow, right? That impression has both kind of what you might call factual and moral or value content, right? It says, well, here is a bowl of chow, but then because he's hungry, Fido sees it as something attractive and good, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then in response to that, it's not that the impression just kind of forces Fido to go to the food. Instead, Fido moves himself to the food in response to the triggering sense impression.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you have animals moving themselves around in response to the information they get from the environment. But animals can't be held responsible for their actions because humans, unlike animals, have reason.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of introduces an important step in their action theory when it comes to humans, because we just don't kind of automatically respond to impressions. Instead, we assent to them. Right. So let's say that I'm hungry. I see a pulled pork sandwich. I say, looks good. But then I have to decide, it is good to eat this sandwich. Eating the sandwich is appropriate. Right. And so because of that extra step, that means it's up to me and under my control what I do, even if it's causally determined the way in which I assent, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, let's say that I have a student who decides to cheat on a paper by using Chat GPT. I mean, this is merely hypothetical, of course. But,
Of course.
That would never happen.
it never happened, but it's a sort of thought experiment time.
Right.
Like, imagine something like this happening. And you say, well, look, the student sat there and he was tempted to cheat on the paper. And maybe he had conflicting motives, right? He was worried about getting caught and he thought it might be bad and he felt some pangs of guilt prospectively over doing it. But he was really stressed out and he really wanted to pass the class and he didn't feel prepared at all. And then out of all these conflicting motives, he thought about it. He said, like, no, he decided to cheat. Right? Well, that was him deciding to cheat. It was under his control, right? It can be attributable to him. When you explain why Joe cheated, it was because of who he is and the process he went through,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, when you give that kind of explanation, it makes it clear why it's appropriate to attribute the action to the agent. And then these Stoics also think why it's appropriate to hold the person accountable for their actions. It was up to them. They
Mm-hmm.
weren't forced to do it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've seen people talk about in the contemporary literature, kind of in light of Frankfurt style cases, which kind of put pressure on that principle we were talking about earlier of alternative possibilities. Mm-hmm. I've seen some people refer to Chrysippus on this and say he might suggest something like Frankfurt's line, which is you don't need to have been able to do otherwise, but the explanation needs to have come from you or be attributable to you in some way.
Right. Yeah, because the Stoics reject the principle of alternate possibilities explicitly, mm-hmm. right? And so they think it doesn't matter if you have alternate possibilities. What matters is that you were the one who is the source of your action. It can be explained via you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's talk more about their reasons for denying the ability to do otherwise. In your chapter, The Stoics on Fate and Freedom in the Routledge Companion to Free Will, you say that they give an ethical and a metaphysical reason for denying PAP or the ability to do otherwise. Could you summarize what those reasons are?
Mm-hmm. Let me start with the metaphysical one, and then I'll move on to the ethical one. The metaphysical one is that they think that if there were the ability to do otherwise, that would introduce what they call motion without a cause, right? So I'm trying to decide whether to eat the pulled pork sandwich or not. And then they say, look, their view is that given who I am, given my beliefs, given my desire, given my character, given the exact content of my perceptual states. Once you give all those things, then that is going to be sufficient for bringing about the action that I perform. But let's say that you deny that and you say that causally speaking, it is open either that I eat the sandwich or I don't eat the sandwich. Well, if in identical circumstances, it's possible for me either to eat the sandwich or not eat the sandwich, there's really no explanation for why I did one or the other, right? It would just be kind of a random causeless fluke. And that is what they say is to introduce motion without a cause. And in pretty much all of Greek philosophy, people did not like motion without a cause. Right? You start with Parmenides saying, from nothing, nothing is. And that's what even Epicurus himself says, and Democritus. And so, denying something like the principle of sufficient reason would be a problem. So that's the metaphysical argument against PAP. Mm-hmm. The ethical argument is that the virtuous person, part of what makes them virtuous is that they are literally unable to perform vicious actions. So part of being a good person is that there's certain things that you can't do. On Stoic standards, I would not count as a virtuous person. But let me go ahead and give an example of my own. Like, let's say that someone came up to me and said, hey, and I'm standing next to my daughter and I have a pretty bad cold. And they say, hey, I'll give you $10 if you spit on your daughter. Not only am I not going to spit on her for $10, I'm not capable of doing it. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you can say, well, you might be capable of doing it, but your character ensures that you won't. Like, the Stoics are going to say, no, that's the wrong way to put it. Right? Because your character is one of the causal things going on here. So it's not merely that you have a power that you, as a matter of fact, won't exercise. It's that given the totality of the circumstances, including who I am, there is no possibility of me performing that vicious action. Right? I'm not going to spit on it. How about $100? No, I'm still not going to do it. Of course not. Right? That would be absurd. And so the later Stoic, Seneca, it was Seneca who said this, said, look, there's a big difference between saying I can't do it because I am kind of physically incapable of it, and I am unable to do it because I cannot want to do it, right? For the virtuous person, they're incapable of doing it because they're incapable of wanting to do it, but they're still incapable of doing it, right? And if you think of something like an ability to, I don't know, mistreat your children, that so-called ability is not something we would want anyway. It kind of gets back to Daniel Dennett, free will, the varieties of freedom worth wanting.
Right.
Yeah. You want, right? I have this weird fluky ability to sometimes occasionally do bad things. And so imagine there's a perfectly virtuous person, but they have a soul that's made up of atoms, and occasionally the atoms swerve to the side, and they were going to do something really good, but the atoms swerve and they just do some random fluky bad stuff instead. That's not an ability you would want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Those are interesting arguments. Well, the Stoics are famous even today for warning against certain emotions. How does the Stoics' ethics relate to negative reactive attitudes like resentment and indignation?
Yeah, so in contemporary discussions of freedom and determinism, people who are really influenced by Peter Strawson, think that genuine moral responsibility has a lot to do with our reactive attitudes, right? So it's not enough to say that I hold responsible in the sense that I have this forward-looking punishment where I punish you because it's going to help reform your character, or I'm going to punish you because it'll help deter other people from performing these vicious actions. Part of our moral responsibility system, as it were, is that I resent you, and therefore you have retributive attitudes where I want to punish you just because I resent you and I want to make you suffer.
Yeah.
And the Stoics reject that. And there are a couple of reasons they reject it. One is one of them is a moral reason, and the other is a prudential reason, although for the Stoics, you can't pull the two apart very cleanly. The moral reason is that the good person wants nothing evil, just like God wants nothing evil. God is beneficent, and God wants all to be happy and to, and to do well. Okay. And that's something that the Stoics pick up from Plato about the nature of good. The good wants to kind of spread good around and make the world the best that they can. And so a retributive attitude where you want someone to suffer or you want to set their interest back, not for some good consequences or to benefit the person who's punished, but just because you think they have it coming to them, that would be vicious, according to the Stoics. Okay. And there, I think they're responding. I don't know whether they're like thinking about it this way, but it contrasts a lot with Aristotle, right? So Aristotle thinks that when it comes to things like anger or the emotion of nemesis, which is related to justice, or this retributive emotion, part of those is that they're backwards looking and you want to punish the person just to express your disdain or your hatred of them. And the Stoics think that that's a bad motion to have. It's also prudentially bad because they're disturbing emotions, right? So the wise person suffers no disturbance, but things like anger, indignation, and resentments are disturbing. They're also based on false value judgments that it would be good and it would be beneficial for me and for others to make a person suffer for its own sake. Right. So it's a bad emotion because it's based on this sort of mistaken value judgment. But it still is in a way backwards looking, because when I punish the person, according to the Stoics, punishment is forward looking. Right. You punish people, and they agree with Plato on this. You punish people mainly as a way of kind of character reform. Right. It's rehabilitative punishment. But it still is in a way backwards looking because the person came to merit this punishment. It's a fitting punishment precisely because they did decide to do something wrong, and their doing something wrong is evidence for that they have a deficient character. And so to punish them is still backwards looking in the sense that this punishment fits what they did and it's fitting for who they are. But you can say all that without having emotions like indignation or resentment.
Yeah. Would they say similar things about positive reactive attitudes like praise and gratitude?
No, because, it gets tricky. The Stoics are famous, or it might be better to say infamous, for saying that the sage, which is the wise person or the moral ideal, is apathetic. They have apatheia. They are without emotion, right? But what's sometimes overlooked in that popular portrayal of the Stoics is that they don't think that the sage is free of all feelings. Okay? There are what the Stoics call the propathei, the positive emotions or the good emotions.
Yeah.
So, for instance, they think, kind of along with Plato, on most interpretations of Plato, I accept this, that only virtue is intrinsically good and only vice is intrinsically bad. They think that the Stoic he won't feel appetites where he thinks like, oh, this burger is really good for me, right? And that you have this longing for it. But they will, for instance, experience joy. And joy is a positive kind of feeling you have towards your own virtue, right? Or they might not have fear, because fear is the mistaken judgment, for instance, that death is bad for you when it's not really, or that it's bad for you to get a cut where it's merely like what they call a dispreferred indifferent. I can get into that if you want to, but it's not really bad, but it's something that's worth avoiding. Okay. But they think that the Stoic sage will experience caution, where he's in positions where he might be tempted or it might be liable to lapse into vice, for instance. right? So there are these other sort of appropriate feelings. So I think like something like gratitude, it gets a little tricky. So gratitude is when someone, I think they would say actually gratitude is good. Actually, because gratitude is an emotion where you feel positive things towards someone and that person benefited you. But if the person genuinely benefited you and that is good for you, that would be an emotion that I think is fitting.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore it would be appropriate and they would say you shouldn't abolish it.
Yeah. Okay.
Interesting.
Right. But if someone else wrongs you, they have done something wrong, but they haven't hurt you. What they've really done is they've hurt themselves by being a vicious person.
So would pity be appropriate in that case instead of resentment or indignation?
The short answer is I'm not sure.
Okay, yeah.
I think pity would probably be more appropriate, but be careful. It depends on whether pity involves you feeling bad on their behalf, though. So I can feel bad for them in the sake, like I said, like, that's too bad for them, man. It sucks to be them.
Yeah.
Right. And so you can feel like you can say like it sucks to be them. And maybe you have compassion or something where you have this affect to want to help them out, but kind of having a fellow feeling in the sense that you feel bad on their behalf and you yourself suffer because of them. That would not be something that would be appropriate.
Yeah. All right.
That makes sense.
Well, you end your chapter that I mentioned a moment ago with a discussion of the Stoic idea that in a certain sense of freedom, only the wise person can be truly free, or the sage. Could you say a bit more about this idea?
Sure. So there are at least two different senses of freedom here, right? So the first sense of freedom, which we've been mainly talking about, is a kind of freedom you need to have in order to be rightly held responsible for your actions. And everyone has that, both sage and fools. And by the way, for these Stoics, pretty much all of us are fools. Heracles and Socrates, and that's about it.
Yeah.
The rest of us, we're all fools. But anyway, leaving that aside, so in that, so look, we have this power of assent. It's up to us. It's under our control, and so in that sense, we're all free. But let me give it an analogy here. I mean, you can imagine someone saying like they have an anger control problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Someone insults my hipster sideburns and says that I'm a lame hipster trying to look hip, but it's really just pathetic. And when they say that, I get the surge of anger and I just start beating them. And that's really bad for me, right? Being that kind of person, having that kind of reaction is bad for me. And you can think of that kind of character trait as something that makes me unfree, right? It prevents me from doing what I really want to do if I were totally aware of things, because what I really want, and this is again something they get from Plato in a dialogue like Gorgias, what we all really want is to be happy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so addictions and character flaws and mistaken ideas about what's good, all these things kind of get in the way of us being fully rational, and they get in the way of us being fully happy.
Mm-hmm.
So you can think of these, character flaws and ignorance and mistaken ideas, all of these things kind of enslave us.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I think that's not such a crazy idea. I mean, like when you think of like literature on addiction, people think of addiction as something like it's part of them, but it's also something that enslaves them.
Right.
And you just, kind of expand that a little bit. But of course, even the person who kind of in Frankfurt's case is kind of wholehearted in their vice, is still going to be someone on the Stoic view who is still kind of trapped by or enslaved by or hindered by not only their kind of base level vice, but even more so maybe by their endorsement of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Well, this has been excellent. Thanks so much for joining us, Tim, and for talking about Epicureanism and Stoicism and some other figures along the way. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Yeah. If anyone is interested in like looking at my stuff, probably the easiest thing is to philpeople.org. So PhilPeople. So philpeople.org. And just type in Tim O'Keefe. I'll pop up. So I have all my publications are there. And for most of them, I have a link to the publication. And I also put up penultimate drafts of everything.
Yeah.
So, if anyone wants to read my stuff, probably the philpeople.org page on me, you can read most of my stuff, except maybe for like the books.
Right.
Yeah.
The books, just buy them and get me money, or from the internet.
Right.
Yeah.
You're hurting yourself if you do that.
Yeah. Thanks again, Tim.
You're welcome. I enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah. In our next episode, we will talk about Plotinus on free will.